Friday, January 20th, 2017, and President Trump is now in charge of the executive branch of the United States government. It was a slow day around here, so I did have time to look in and see what happened with the activities today, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about what my impressions were of Inauguration 2017. I began with a couple of scripture readings and an invocation. It was fine with me to see Cardinal Timothy Dolan there and Reverend Samuel Rodriguez there. Wasn't particularly thrilled to see Paula White. She's not one of my favorite people. The chairman of the Joint Congressional Committee for Inaugural Ceremonies this year happened to be Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri. And his introduction was too much of a speech, I thought. Strange thing, when you give people an opportunity to get up in front of people, they tend to say a lot more than they should. And most people who drag out their speeches don't really understand that people aren't really interested in everything that they have to say unless the speaker happens to be me, of course. But most people have a tendency to just go on. And so I thought his introduction was a little bit too heavy on words. But eventually he did get things going, and it moved from the invocations into the first musical performance, a number I didn't recognize from, I think, the University of Missouri Chorus, and then the swearing in of Vice President Pence by Justice Clarence Thomas. But Justice Thomas was introduced by the Senate Minority Leader, the Senate Democratic Leader, Chuck Schumer. And I don't know what possessed Schumer to think that he needed to be delivering a speech, but he also delivered a speech. But in spite of all this too much talking business, the ceremony did move so that the swearing in took place close to 12 o'clock. So that worked out pretty well, even though this tendency for people to talk too much was clearly evident. It didn't mess things up too bad. Now, as to the speech delivered by President Trump, some important things. A couple of analysts said, and I had to agree with them, that if they didn't know it was Donald Trump speaking, they might think it was Bernie Sanders speaking. I know a lot of Sanders supporters will not like that at all and will go ballistic over it because President Trump, did not support particularly a higher minimum wage or universal health care or free college education. But when you take those away and get to the economic message, it was a populist economic message. He talked about rusted out factories scattered like tombstones over the landscape. There you have it. Right there is the reason that Donald Trump won the election. In 2016, it was going to be an outsider. It was going to be Bernie Sanders or it was going to be Donald Trump. If it wasn't going to be one, it was going to be the other. And it was issues like that, like Trump referred to, rusted out factories scattered like tombstones. When you get to some of the basics as far as focusing on economically hurting people, Sanders and Trump are a lot closer together than even they themselves would like to believe when you talk about the matter of saving American jobs and creating American jobs. And I've seen the effects that globalization and some free trade have had on small southern towns. There used to be a lot of small southern towns where there were good paying factory jobs, and then the good paying factory jobs went away, and then you had factories that didn't pay so well, and then even the factories that didn't pay so well went away, and they were replaced with largely nothing. NAFTA didn't help, nothing to do with free trade helped, and people were mad as hell about that because they have had to lower their standard of living. Another very important thing about Trump's message, which was it was more populist than it was conservative. That is, you didn't hear a lot of the things that you usually hear from conservative politicians. Specifically, there wasn't a discussion about shrinking government per se, which that was the big thing that Ronald Reagan said when he first took office in 1981. And it has always been part of the central dogma of the conservative movement that limited government, small government, that government can't do anything right, and that the proper thing to do is to always shrink government. But you didn't hear that from Trump today, and that's very important, because there are a lot of things that people are extremely worried about since he got into the race and won the nomination and then won the presidency. But none of those things are the things that have caused the most problems in the United States over the last 30 years or so. What's caused the most problems is this idea of economic conservatism and cutting government down to nothing. That's what's caused an awful lot of the problems, and President Trump doesn't appear inclined to go that way. Instead, he wants to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure. And instead of cutting the budget, cutting government, and doing all those things that conservatives tend to want to do, he talks about things that cost a lot of money, like building a border wall, like infrastructure, and numerous other programs, and renegotiating fair trade deals. So it wasn't a conservative speech per se, and that kind of bodes well for the future, because even if he gets pulled in a more conservative direction by people in the House and Senate who are part of the conservative movement, there are still exceptions in his platform that, if he gets them through, could actually make things better, specifically trade policy, infrastructure, border security, and also national security. That could help some as well. So Trump's message was essentially populist. It was not conservative. One analyst that I would listen to today said that it was more like a third party candidate had gotten elected than a conservative, because he came down pretty hard on the political establishment, and it wasn't just the Democrats he was hard on. He was hard on Republicans. He was extremely harsh with Democrats, with Barack Obama and Bill Clinton sitting there, and also on Republicans with George Bush sitting there. And so he was very much like a third-party candidate. So that's going to make some things very interesting in the next few years. Mrs. Melania Trump was very attractive. I'm not normally one to pay attention to the fancy dresses that people wear to these things, but she wore a sort of a powdered blue dress with an interesting design, sort of a wraparound design at the front, and she meets my definition of an attractive woman of her age. As a matter of fact, she has this very severe expression, oftentimes, that I've described it as she looks something like a queen, or a member of nobility or something. And she is from Europe. She is from Slovenia. So it was a populist message. It wasn't a conservative message per se. If it had been a conservative message, then I would say that people, economically conservative, that is, if it had been an economically conservative message, then I would say that people had reason to be scared to death. If it was Ted Cruz or John Kasich or Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush or even Rick Perry taking the oath, and I'd say there'd be an awful lot to worry about, and people should be as scared then as they seem to be now. But the economic message that President Trump is putting forward, is actually more of a populist message. It seems to be one where he's listened to the concerns of a lot of people that have been ignored. And so, while I'm certainly not going to get everything that I wanted under a Trump administration, I can't help but feel somewhat better about his administration than I do about some of the others who have gotten in, although I would certainly have preferred Bernie Sanders. Now, there were some protests that took place today in Washington, but they weren't anywhere near as large as people thought they were going to be. They were largely ineffective. About 200, I think more than 200 people got arrested, and the things that they were doing were screaming out in the street, throwing rocks, destroying property, and all of this mess when nothing has been done up to this point that would justify that kind of behavior. And I couldn't help looking at those people and the way that they were behaving and thinking, that even if some of the things that they say might eventually have some validity, that's questionable, but even if it does, those are not the kind of people I really want to be identified with, because their behavior was just awful and their logic in doing it was extremely flawed, because, to put it bluntly, demonstrations and such don't accomplish very much. Right after the November election, I got an email from this organization called Sojourners. It is a part of what you might call the Christian left, because my theology is less conservative than that of a lot of people I know. And Jim Wallace, I used to kind of like him, but the first thing he says the day after the election is, "Tomorrow we march." And I'm thinking, what the hell is the point of that? Because the side that you supported lost the election, and that's really all you can do is win elections, and the people who won aren't going to pay any attention to you. They don't care. And besides, their priorities haven't been that great. It's funny that you didn't see all these protests when the economy fell to pieces. And I would think that if anything was going to motivate people rising up in the streets, it would be a very bad economy and about 12 million people out of work, like happened under George W. Bush in the last part of his administration. But that doesn't seem to be the thing that's motivating a lot of protesters. It seems to be other peripheral issues, because they're excessively worried about what might happen with this group or that group or the other group. And really, the issues that people get so worried about, that isn't why the white working class voted for Trump. They voted for him because of this thing he said about rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape. That's what people are worried about. It's those kitchen table issues. And I know that it'll be a kitchen table issue for some people if Obamacare gets repealed, that some people will get hurt because of that. But I worked directly with Obamacare, and it wasn't the great and awesome thing that people made it out to be. I've explained that before. Because of the Medicaid gap and because of premiums and deductibles, there were just a lot of problems with it, and there was no way that that was going to be fixed, because in 2010 the Tea Party took over the House of Representatives, and there was no way that they were ever going to cooperate to fix it. And then in the 2016 election, it was a done deal all along that Republicans were going to keep the House, and so they would not have cooperated with Hillary Clinton to fix the problem, and the problems were very major. So the ceremony itself seemed to go pretty well. The protester didn't make much of an impact. There's going to be a huge march tomorrow. That probably won't make much of an impact either. The message that President Trump is putting forth is largely populist. It is not conservative per se. If he actually accomplishes a lot of the things that he promised that he will do in that 16-minute speech today, which was very political, and it was a direct attack on previous policies, but if he is successful in accomplishing the things that he outlined today, then it'll be pretty good for everybody. Now, whether that'll happen or not remains to be seen. It could be that members of the House and Senate will pull that administration too far to the right economically, but so far he's resisting the urge to go that way, that small government cut the budget to nothing thing that has caused so many problems over the years. So I would simply say that it's probably a good idea just to kind of keep an open mind and see what happens. Any which way you look at it, these are interesting times in the United States.